My love story with Taiwan started when I was 20, which is quite an early age, but I'm very happy to say that because I'm still very young. In 5 years, my research on Taiwan will have lasted already half of my life. And after 5 years, every year that will pass will add one more year, and soon it will be maybe 2/3 and 3/3 of my life. So I went to Taiwan for the first time when I was 20. That was in 1992, if I remember correctly. And that was my first discovery, soon followed by my first research when I was a master's student at Sciences Po in Paris. And my advisor asked me why I was interested by Taiwan, and my reply was that because Taiwan seems to have a very interesting question of national identity. So that was in 1993 when I was back, and at that time, if you remember, Taiwan was under the Lee Teng-hui presidency. The temporary provisions had been lifted 2 years before, and Taiwan was democratizing at a fast pace, but was still far behind what it became later and what it is now. And I did not know a lot about Taiwan at that time, but then I was not wrong. There was really a real question of national identity. Not many persons would say it abroad at that time. The period of the Kuomintang control of Taiwan was not over, and though everything was changing, the question of identity was still very sensitive at that time. And then during the 90s, two movements that I witnessed when I moved to Taiwan in 1994 developed together, which are very interesting in Taiwan's political development experience, which are democratization and the public discussion of national identity. And the two movements are really very closely linked to each other. Without the national identity question, the democratization in Taiwan wouldn't have probably developed at such a fast pace. But without the democratization of Taiwan, the national identity question wouldn't have been discussed that quickly and that extensively. So the combination of these two movements is very interesting in Taiwan's experience. Now, how do I situate and position my research in this field? When I arrived in Taiwan in 1994, one of the first friends I made there was a second-generation mainlander. And he was a very nice person, except that from the political point of view, he was kind of radical. A radical that that had political opinions that many mainlanders in Taiwan now would not even have. And from his point of view, I quickly understood that the mainlanders were feeling a kind of identity crisis in Taiwan. And I was very young at the time. I was 23 or 24. I had hardly registered in the PhD program at Sciences Po in Paris, so I did not know much. But I knew that the mainlanders were a minority and that the mainlanders had moved to Taiwan in 1949 in the psychological conditions we know. I had, in fact, already written an MA thesis on Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek, so I had read pretty much many books about Taiwan. But that's perhaps the reason why I decided to concentrate immediately on this issue, because in a way I felt very clearly that that was the core issue. And I think that still today, in 2006, it's still a very central issue. A long time has passed ever since I got my MA thesis, my PhD thesis. I wrote 2 books, including one in Chinese. But in recent years, especially before the 2004 presidential elections, many scholars abroad, I mean by abroad, outside of Taiwan or America or France, outside of Taiwan, meaning in America or France or Europe, many scholars in recent years started to tell me, Stephane, you are still talking about mainlanders, but you know the ethnic issues in Taiwan are less and less important. And I never agreed with that. First, I've never said that the main dividing issue in Taiwan is between mainlanders and Taiwanese. That's, of course, really exaggerated. Second, this division, if it's not the most important one, still very deeply impacts the other divisions, namely not unification versus independence, not being Taiwanese against being mainlanders or being Taiwanese against being Chinese. This main dividing line being having a strong Chinese consciousness or having a strong Taiwanese consciousness. And I add strong, this word, because you can be both at the same time, like having a Chinese consciousness and a Taiwanese consciousness at the same time. But the main division line is between those who have a strong feeling of being Chinese and those who have a strong feeling of being Taiwanese. And this is a distinct dividing line, distinct from the notion of being pro-independence or pro-unification. It is closely linked to the perception of Taiwan as a nation or as a specific part of a greater Chinese ensemble. But what is sure is that it is a very useful dividing line to oppose Chineseness and Taiwaneseness, or Chinese consciousness, 中国意识, and Taiwaneseness, Taiwan 意识. Why? Because it's a very elaborate division, in the sense that you can have a strong Chineseness, but still feel sympathetic to Taiwan's independence. Or the opposite, feeling a strong Taiwaneseness, but not being in favor of Taiwan independence. So that's a more useful division or operating tool than to oppose 外乡人 and 本省人, mainlanders and native Taiwanese.
Hold on.
And so I think
Hold
that...
on. I'm not recording yet. Okay.
And so I think this division is still very important today. I think nobody would deny it, considering what is happening in Taiwan since the last presidential election. But before discussing that, perhaps we could go back to the period when Li Tenghui was president, try to analyze it, see what happened at that time, and what has changed ever since, and what are the differences between the mentality of people, both mainlanders and Taiwanese, in Taiwan during that period and now. It happens that my PhD research was entirely devoted to this very precise topic. What do the mainlanders feel in Taiwan under the Li Tenghui era about the questions of nationhood, Taiwanese identity, Taiwanese unification or independence, and their status, position, and feelings within and towards the Taiwanese society. That survey was made under Li Tenghui, so it was not made afterwards and asking them to think and express what they thought at that time. So the study was conducted in 1997, and I wrote a book in Chinese about this called 风和日暖, Light Wind and Warm Sun. And the conclusions of this study and the conclusion of the book shows that during the Li Tenghui period there was an undeniable Taiwanization movement of the mainlanders. Of course, many people would deny it now, and even then, many people would deny that they had become Taiwanese. However, after making clusters and grouping individuals into different categories, from the most conservative regarding national unification or Taiwanese independence and Taiwan's identity, to the most inclined to understand or appreciate what we would call today a green point of view about Taiwanese identity and future. After classifying those people into different opinion groups, I realized that even the most pro-unification people had become Taiwanese already. And this argument pleased the mainlanders in Taiwan very much when I published this book. But there were other arguments that made them more angry or less satisfied about my book. The same happened for the Green camp, satisfied with a few arguments and dissatisfied with others, which is perhaps an indication that the book was not that bad. So many people denied that they had become Taiwanese already, or partially Taiwanese. But then it was very obvious through the answers they made about different questions related to those core issues of Taiwanese nationhood, etc. And to get a sense of plurality in their opinion, I asked the same question different ways, and I analyzed the differences between different answers to what was basically the same question, but asked from another point of view. And that was a pretty clear indication of what was happening in Taiwan at that time. What is interesting is now to define what would be this Taiwanization movement. The so-called Taiwanization movement was a feeling of really belonging to this land, having rooted down, and feeling part of the Taiwanese community of faith. Even starting learning Taiwanese for some, and even at the end of the 90s, being quite pleased to show that they were able to use a few Taiwanese words in their discourse. But that stopped short to feeling part of a Taiwanese nation. I said feeling part of a Taiwanese community of faith. Yes, probably for many of them, but not of a Taiwanese nation. And that is the bottom line and the real difference. Taiwanization of the mainlander really means that they started to feel belonging to this land, but not supporting independence for most of them, or not considering Taiwan as being anything else than at most a specific part of Chinese culture with a specific history and very probably a pluralistic identity, but just as other parts of China with a very complex local identity. So that was very clear, both their Taiwanization and that this feeling of being Taiwanese was different from the feeling of being Taiwanese by the native Taiwanese. Saying this in very simple words takes us back to the root of the problem today. I think it has been expressed in this sentence. And this has changed a lot now. Because when Li Tenghui was president, nobody would expect that the Greens would come to power. That was still at that time, I recall very precisely, I was living at that time, that was still like a theoretical option that nobody would really think about seriously, of course, except for the militants of the Green camp, who would really long for that and desire for that very deeply, and by every political observer in the months before the 2000 presidential election, when it became technically possible that the Green camp would win. But apart from this period, during the 90s, nobody in Taiwan, especially among the mainlanders, would expect the transition of power for 2000. And if you remember, Li Tenghui put a lot of efforts in helping Lian Zhan to be elected, even though some people say that, well, his efforts were ambiguous and that he played for the Green camp at the same time. I'm not sure that it's really true, but whatever. And so the mainlanders were feeling that they had no other possibility than identifying to this land. Though at the same time, most of them had a bad opinion of Li Tenghui, and part of them really hated Li Tenghui to an extent that has never been met or has rarely been met in Western democracies, except perhaps today in America for people who haven't voted for George Bush and are very unhappy with his being president of the United States. But this is important to say because it shows why things have changed during with the 2004 presidential election and the transfer of power. Because what happened, no, not 2004, sorry, with the 2000 power transfer, because what happened was precisely what was unbelievable. The situation that I have just described during the late 90s has deeply changed now, and this happened with the 2000 presidential election and the power transfer, and it was increased or deepened by the following presidential election, the contested 2004 election, and especially deepened in recent months with the financial scandals that are developing in Taiwan now. What happened in 2000 was that the mainlanders witnessed what had appeared during the 90s as precisely the unbelievable. A pro-independence, Taiwan-born president of the DPP becoming the president of what the ROC, the Republic of China. So what we had witnessed before, this Taiwanization movement, making people like me and others saying that, well, it's game over for the Feizhu Liupai, the non-mainstream faction, meaning the anti-Li Tenghui clan within the KMT party. Those people had stopped to voice their opposition already. And this is what changed. The mainlanders, after the 2000 presidential election, started to voice their opposition again. That was the first step. But they remained quite quiet in comparison to their attitude now, even though in the first mandate presidency of Chen Shui-bian, they really expressed strong opposition already and developed a lot of political strategies and strength and influence to prevent the president to do what he wanted to do. I would just quote two little examples. The first one was the use of the nuclear power plant pretext to ask for the first time the president to resign, or even more precisely to force him to resign by trying to impeach him. I would like to comment here that in terms of constitutional analysis, everyone in the West knows that impeaching a president cannot be known in a dual executive system such as Taiwan's or France's system for a political reason, because a president is elected to implement his political goals, and he can be impeached only in case of high treason, meaning endangering the sovereignty of the nation by discussing with the enemy or compromising on the nation's sovereignty. And this should be the only reason why you impeach a president, and not because you disagree with his politics and policies. Another case would be if he has breached the constitutional order and did something which is against the constitution, which did not happen. That is the first example. And the second example I would take is about the 认识 Taiwan, Knowing Taiwan textbook affair. If you remember, in 1997, when Li Tenghui was still president, the Ministry of Education under the Kuomintang party decided, and especially the Taiwan faction within the party, obtained from the Minister of Education that an educational reform was launched starting in 1994, and the outcome was that in 1997 the ministry adopted a new series of textbooks at the junior high level called Knowing Taiwan, and that had been adopted within a fierce political battle between what we call now the Greens and the Blues over the issue. Finally, the pro-reform camp won, and this first program putting an emphasis on Taiwanese history and society was adopted. And I really thought at that time that it had been a hard fought battle won by the progressive camp, the Taiwan faction, and that probably it would be unthinkable and impossible for the Blues to overcoming. And when the Green came into power, then I thought, okay, that's going probably to go on. And what happened was absolutely surprising. In 2001 or 2002, through its legislative majority, the Blue camp obtained from the ministry that they abandoned this reform that had been applied since 3 years already at the time, which is a clear indication that even under the first presidency of Chen Shui-bian, the Blues have never abandoned their efforts to counteract and to counter the president and the Green camp on the so-called Taiwanization of Taiwan, or the promotion of a Taiwanese point of view. However, there were two examples to show that they still voiced strong opposition, but that was nothing compared to what happened later on. I think there is a big difference between Chen Shui-bian's first presidency and Chen Shui-bian's second presidency, which means that between Li Tenghui's presidency between 1996 and 2000, Chen's first term and Chen's second term, there is a gradual evolution of the mainlander positioning of mainlander political elite regarding this issue of Taiwanese consciousness and Taiwanese identity. They started again to voice their opposition, as I said, after 2000, but then the political earthquake of 2004 happened, and everybody knows the different contending opinions about what happened, the assassination attempt, and the contested electoral results. I'm certainly not going to say any comment on these two issues, but what I just want to say here is that the way the Blues have interpreted both events, the assassination attempt and the debated result, provoked a deep feeling of having been cheated and a feeling of insecurity in Taiwan. Many of them have been convinced that they have been deprived of their legitimate victory, and things turned out very, very bad after that. The Greens, in response, interpreted the Blues move as one more attempt to prevent the Green Taiwanese to rule Taiwan, and that was really enough for them. So things really started to be ugly after 2004, and the pace of accusation of the two camps, mutual accusations, became really nasty, especially after April and May 2006, when Chiu Yi came up with this question of the corruption of this president's son-in-law, and that everybody started to position himself or herself about whether the President Chen should stay in power or not. That is what has changed since the Li Tenghui era, because it's hard to see now any mainlander doing what they did at the time, taking pride into using Taiwanese language and acknowledging that they are both Chinese and Taiwanese. We nowadays hear many mainlanders in Taiwan say, again, I'm Chinese, 我是中国人, full stop. I'm Chinese and nothing else. And this is not new, because it was what they would say for decades before the 90s. But there was this moment when we could imagine that despite political feuds and crises and ambiguities, both camps would compromise, the Green and not being too radical on the independence issue, and the Blues being eager to acknowledge that, well, it might be a pity, but Taiwan and China have been separated for such a long time. Our political systems are so different. We definitely belong to a distinct political entity, and unification with China would be done at the expense of our freedom and our style and level of life. We could hope that at that time the two camps would agree to work together, at least to perhaps not found a new nation, certainly not, but at least belong to a common people, as long as it was not called a nation. But this is over now. Everybody will feel, when you're blue, that talking about a Taiwanese people means talking about Taiwanese identity and Taiwanese independence. And everyone in the Green camp would feel that when you claim that you are Chinese, you still favor unification, whereas China is menacing Taiwan, both politically and militarily. And that is why the discussion has become nasty now. And I was reading recently some stuff about the Tibetan movement in exile. And in recent months, I have discussed many times with Tibetan experts and experts of the Tibetan question, and also Tibetans in exiles and French militants for the Tibetans. And I saw some common points between Taiwan and Tibet regarding the issue of identity, who we are in front of omnipotent China, an over-powerful China, which in the case of Tibet controls Tibet, and in the case of Taiwan wants to control Taiwan, and currently influences its destinies by playing a big role in the game, influencing Taiwan's domestic politics. What is the common point between the two? There is an ongoing debate in Tibetan circles, Tibetan independence militant circles, on what is the attitude to be followed in dealing with China. Two schools, very simply. One is saying that China is the invader, menacing Tibetan culture, being guilty of perpetrating a cultural genocide, if not an ethnic genocide in Tibet. And that there is no way to discuss with China, because anyway she will win in the end, and that her attitude is absolutely disgusting. And the other school of thought, the one which is seems to be followed by the Dalai Lama, is to find a way to engage China, to make compromises, and to refrain absolutely from having any anti-Chinese behavior. But you see, this is very, very common, very similar to what happens, some of the discussions within the Blue Camp, and how to deal with the notion of mainlander identity, mainlander power and influence in Taiwan, and Chinese attitude towards Taiwan. One school in the Greens says that considering what happened in the last 40 years, and considering the ambiguities, what they call the ambiguities of the Blues, to become part of the Taiwanese nation, the reluctance that they have to become part of it, and considering their strategies now to do whatever is possible to obtain the departure of the president, and having preventing the government, the Green government, to rule and apply, to do what they wanted to do for 6 years through the Blues legislative majority. The Green say, well, there is no way to discuss with these people, because whatever we do, anyway, they will oppose it. But of course, as we all know, not everyone agree in the Green camp regarding this strategy. There are still many people saying that, well, we should try find a way to discuss with the Blues and be more sensitive to their position, understand their point of view, and try to work together with them to find something that is in the interest of Taiwan, and saying that our common enemy anyway is China and not the mainlanders. But of course, other people in the Green camp reply to this is a naive attitude, because whatever happens, the mainlanders will anyway oppose our policies, and that their only aim is to recover power in Taiwan. And I have to say that unfortunately, this latter argument finds some illustrations in Taiwan. For instance, when Ma Ying-jeou was elected to the Taipei mayorship in 1998, there were people who said in Chinese this incredible sentence, 我们终于光复台北了. We have at last recovered Taipei. But anyone understanding Chinese knows what Guangfu means. Guangfu was the word used by the Nationalist Party to describe the so-called 1945 retrocession of Taiwan to China. And Guangfu, in this case, means we are reinstated in our legitimate position of the ruler of Taiwan in the first case, Taipei in the second. And this mentality shows in the word of some Green theoreticians and militants that the mainlanders in Taiwan have a colonialist point of view on Taiwan, thinking that they are the legitimate rulers of Taiwan, even though they are a minority coming from abroad, and even though their regime has deeply Taiwanized in Taiwan, and is certainly not anymore what it was 60 years ago when it moved to Taiwan. And for this reason, I think the mainlanders should do their best to understand the logic and legitimacy of the Taiwanese population, just as if we want to make some progress into ethnic understanding in Taiwan, just as the Greens also must be sensitive to the Blues' sensitivity. But we should never forget one thing, is that Taiwan, whether you like it or not, is already independent from China, has a different political regime, and that the mainlanders are a minority. It doesn't mean that the majority rules all the time and should dictate its policy to the minority. But the fact is that the mainlanders are a minority, and if they are Taiwanized, they still have way too much compassion for a regime in China that is threatening Taiwan's liberties by asking for a unification with a regime that is not democratic. And in this way, we should say that, well, at least in my position, I hope it's not biased, even though it is very subjective. In this way, when I hear both sides' arguments against the other side, I really personally find the Green camp's argument more acceptable, because whenever they want to say something regarding Taiwanese identity, Taiwanese nation, Taiwan's future, the place of Taiwanese culture in Taiwan, they are always opposed by a minority that still reflect the past political socialization. If only the mainlanders could free themselves from the socialization of the past, what they learned at school, in the media, and so on, they would probably be more at ease with the notion of Taiwan identity, which is perhaps not a deep tendency of history or something that cannot, that is only the only way to survive in Taiwan or feel Taiwanese. But it's the deep trend, it's the Zhuliu, it's the main trend. I mean, because simply numerically speaking, Taiwanese are the majority, and they are in an island called Taiwan, which is an island, a specific part, which is not a province like Sichuan or Hubei, which is on the mainland among other Chinese regions or provinces. This is a basic historical, cultural, linguistic, geopolitical, and even geographical fact that the mainlanders refuse to acknowledge. But they would say, they would reply to this, we don't refuse to acknowledge it. We absolutely accept it. We even feel we are part of this country, but the Taiwanese do not want us to be part of it. This argument is very interesting, and I can feel that many mainlanders feel miserable because of that. At the same time, I'm trying to build the argument like I've heard so many times between Taiwanese and mainlanders. At the same time, the Taiwanese would reply to this, we do give you a room in this Taiwanese nation. We do appeal, we do call you, ask you to be a member of it, members of it. The problem is that you are willing to be part of it as long as it is not considered a nation. And that is exactly why the mainlanders opposed Li Tengwe's theory of Xin Taiwanren in the 90s, which happens to be the most elaborate proposition ever done in Taiwan for conflict harmony. But then the mainlanders really opposed it because it means for them being part of a nation, and they refuse to consider Taiwan a nation. And I think that the question of the nation in Taiwan, where is the nation, where does it start and where does it lay, is the core question, and all the other derived from it. Economic arguments, geopolitical arguments, and domestic political arguments, in fact, all revolve around this issue that we don't discuss because it's too sensitive. Is Taiwan a nation or not? To conclude, I would say that in the 90s and early 2000, I was quite optimistic and even fascinated by what was invented in Taiwan, that kind of laboratory of identities, trying to find a way to be together and avoid political turmoil and ethnic feuds. And as you probably understood from what I said earlier, I'm not that optimistic right now, and I would even say that I turned quite pessimistic, because in recent years, after completing my PhD research and under the Chen Shui-bian administration, I kept on asking questions to as many common people I could, much less to politicians, but common people of every side, blue or green. And what I find is that apparently everybody lives very well together in Taiwan, not talking about political issues and having neighbors of the other ethnic group, and everything goes quite well. But everything goes quite well because we don't talk politics. It doesn't mean that politics are not within every people's mind. And what makes me pessimistic is that I'm now definitely convinced that the political opposition derives from a different worldview and a different memory of a common past, that this diverging opinion is far more important in the Taiwanese psyche and Taiwanese politics, which means in the geopolitics of the Taiwan Straits, that what many people say. And I think deeply that Taiwanese and mainlanders cannot understand each other. They can talk to each other. They can intellectually, rationally find a way to dialogue and to build something together. But emotionally speaking, there is no way to understand each other. Even though ethnic marriages have since 2 or 3 decades is the problem, it's surging again. And of course it has a geopolitical impact. Some people are wondering whether China will attack Taiwan or not. Personally, I don't think so, for many reasons. I could give two of them to you. The first is that if China wanted to attack Taiwan, then why China hasn't done it already? Because as the time is passing, it's going to be even more difficult, since Taiwan is more and more mediatized abroad, and that more and more people know that Taiwan is a sovereign country. The second reason is that China will not need to attack Taiwan if the current political situation goes on, and if Taiwanese and mainlanders are really unable to talk to each other, then Taiwanese democracy is threatened, and the global response from the Taiwanese society as a whole to the Chinese pressure will weaken further. It's already very weak, extremely weak, and it will go on weakening. And this will lead Taiwan to fall by itself, not without Chinese intervention. Only the ongoing pressure and the power of attraction that is produced by a rising China on those who are looking to China today in Taiwan. And in a way it reminds me with the way the Manchu regime in 1683 finally got Taiwan, when China, for the first time ever, obtained Taiwan and claimed sovereignty on it the following year in 1684, in April 1684, when the Manchu emperor integrated Taiwan into the Qing Empire. We often say that China has tried several times, a dozen of times, to invade and attack Taiwan before it finally succeeded in 1683. What happened in 1683 was extremely similar to what is happening now in Taiwan. Shi Lang led his fleet to Taiwan but stayed in the Penghu archipelago. And at the first sight of the Manchu fleet, the Zheng regime, led by the very young Zheng Keshuang, Zheng Zhengkong's grandson, immediately surrendered without even trying to oppose the Chinese threat. Why? Because the regime was divided, weakened, because the ruler was weak, he was too young, because the regime was corrupted, and that the last civil servants and rulers around Zheng Keshuang had taken the opportunity of their position to enrich themselves, and instead of developing what Zheng Zhengkong and especially his son Zheng Qing had done, turning Taiwan into a powerful economy. And then the regime scrambled and immediately surrendered to the Qing dynasty. I'm afraid that this might happen much more likely than a war in the Taiwan Strait, making China reaching its goal without even having to fire one of its numerous missiles. So what I'm afraid is that China will not even have to fire one of its numerous missiles, and that if the Taiwanese and mainlanders go on fighting over Taiwanese identity, and if the degree of mistrust goes on developing this way, the regime will crumble on itself and offering China a very simple victory. I'm not sure that a war in the Taiwan Strait is likely, but it's much more likely that if the problem is solved, it will be solved in this way.